Let's get started. Thank you all very much for joining us for our last this semester presentation conversation on the rethinking work and how the workplace is evolving. I'm Anna Tevis, Academic Director and Clinical Professor of Human Capital Management here at NYU School of Professional Studies. And I have a very special pleasure to welcome to you tonight Haig Nabaltian, who is a senior partner, Chantal, next slide, a senior partner at Mercer and a founder and leader of Mercer's Workforce Science Institute. Haig is a organizational and labor economist, and he's been instrumental in developing Mercer's capability to measure the economic impact of human capital management in organizations. He was named one of Consulting Magazine's top 25 consultants for excellence in client service. You know, he's got a really long bio and a distinguished bio that we recommend you look through. But what really caught my attention was Haig's connections to NYU. And I think this is why he was so willing to come and talk to us tonight, because he was on the faculty of economics at New York University and a research scientist at NYU CV Star Center for Applied Economics in his formative years, right, Haig?
Very much
and so. Another piece of information and connection to NYU, I hear that your mother was the chair of comparative literature department at NYU as well.
She was. And I went as an undergraduate to NYU before going to Columbia for graduate economics. So
yes,
deep connections.
We're gonna forgive you the Columbia, but here you are. Here you are. And without further ado, we are going to give you the screen. And what we're gonna do is, as we always, please put your questions in the chat. We'll have Haig walk us through his latest research. And then we're going to have a robust conversation about some of the really provocative data that you're going to see here tonight. Now the screen is yours.
Okay, and I hope you're seeing my screen. Everything good?
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Anna, for your introduction and for the kind invitation to come and share some of the learnings that I have written about in the most recent white paper, An Employer's Guide to Achieving and Sustaining Pay and Career Equity Work. It's always a pleasure for me to come back to NYU. I've done it periodically. And as you mentioned, I kind of got my career this launched in the interface between academe and practice, working at the Starr Center. And that propelled me to a thoroughly fulfilling career, kind of helping organizations use more evidence-based and economic approaches to the people side of business. And that's where the insights that I'm going to share today come from. We started our workforce sciences, workforce strategy and analytics group, as it's called now, in the early 90s. And the whole idea was that HR was too driven by benchmarking, best practice comparisons, by survey work, and a lot of asking. And there wasn't enough hard observation about the realities taking place in organizations. And there wasn't enough hard science in looking at where does this value come from in a workforce, right? What are the characteristics of a workforce that create value? What are the workforce management practices associated with better workforce outcomes and better business performance? So that was our mission from the start in 1994. And the hallmark, if I had to identify one thing that really jumped out from this kind of work over these many years, is that the effectiveness of human capital management is quite context specific. What works well in one environment may not work the same way in another, may actually work in the opposite direction. The workforce characteristics that matter most in one business environment, cultural environment, operational reality may not have the same effect in another. So a lot of variance. We used to say context is everything. And so we had taken the approach of doing deep dive analyses of workforce and business performance data in client firms to help inform their workforce and people strategies. But over the years, one of the things that became quite apparent is that when it comes to the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion dimension of people strategies, there are more universal and generalizable patterns. There are some things that seem to occur repeatedly, and it suggests that the realities of the challenges around DEI, the broader business and social challenges, are so strong that they dominate the unique cultural and operational context of firms. So I set out to look a little more carefully through the various analytical studies that I've been personally involved in client work to see if indeed my sense that, wow, I keep seeing this same thing over and over again. Why is this the case? To see if that indeed was the reality. And that was the origin of this paper. Just the key themes that I'm going to try to cover in the time we have together. I'm not going to go in detail now, but just wanted to flag them for you. When it comes to representation, there's progress, yes, but the reality is women and people of color in middle and upper levels, representation lags substantially. And you have this common pattern, even in organizations where there are a lot of women in the workforce, a lot of minorities in the workforce. As you move up the hierarchy, representation drops dramatically till it gets to quite low levels in the upper ranks, virtually a universal. Another thing I'm going to talk about is that we see, again, despite progress over these many years, significant unexplained disparities in promotion, performance ratings, and pay. They persist. Most progress with respect to pay, although there still are pay gaps, substantial gaps when it comes to promotion and performance. And you can see I highlight the word unexplained to contrast it with what's in the next bullet about explained differences. This is an essential theme of the learnings we have, because unexplained disparities are those differences in outcomes that persist even after you account for the many other factors that legitimately affect the outcome. So there are many things that affect a person's pay. There are many things that affect whether someone is promoted or not. And if we build a statistical model and account for them, we're going to end up with a portrait of explained differences, how a particular factor, say educational attainment, influences your pay, how the role you're in influences your pay. But then very often we're going to find that even after we account for that, there are differences that are not explained by factors in the model. And most of the attention historically has been on the unexplained differences, because those are the ones that are most suggestive of bias or some forms of discrimination at work, right? And the lawyers have always been concerned about this. That's why they have traditionally been very touchy about this kind of analytical work. The good news is less and less so, because more and more organizations want to understand through their data what are the blockages, what is standing in the way of us achieving our DE&I goals. Another theme that I'm going to really hit hard on, that is the core of this paper, is that there are very important explained disparities in success. And they emanate from 5 factors that we see predominantly at work in organizations: differences in performance ratings related to the group you're in and the demographics that you have, differences in access to critical roles, we'll call them accelerator roles, and I'll give some examples. Reporting relationships, who you report to, who your supervisor is, and who your team members are. Internal mobility, whether you're moving a lot. I'm going to talk about how many leadership development programs are predicated on building breadth through frequent moves and mobility. And sometimes that really works against certain people, particularly women, at certain points in their career when they may be less mobile. And then finally, an area that's getting a lot of play in the post-COVID world, flexible work arrangements, things that enable people to continue to work as they manage their personal time, whether it's remote working, working part-time, taking leaves, flex time and the like. Historically, those have been career killers. And I'm going to show you that. There is a question now whether after COVID and people becoming more accustomed and acculturated to flexible working arrangements, whether the historic data that I've tapped into is still relevant. The answer is unclear, but that's important. And then finally, the message I really want to highlight is that when organizations understand, identify, measure the explained differences, they are often the most promising avenue to accelerating progress. Just dealing with the bias concern and trying to get rid of unexplained differences is simply not enough. And I'm going to show you that through some examples. So I talk in the title about pay and career equity. They really go together. They interact with each other. We've had a huge surge in the last decade of organizations aggressively and with high discipline assessing pay equity in their workforce on an annual basis. That's very good news, and it's leading to a lot of progress on pay. And what that pay equity work involves is assessing the pay of people in your workforce at different levels, in different parts of the business, in different geographies, and using statistical models to account for legitimate differences in pay, and then assessing whether after you account for those legitimate differences, there is any unexplained disparity that still persists. And most organizations that focus on it, when they find unexplained disparities, they develop remediation strategies to try and eliminate them. So they come to a point where they're able to say, we have achieved pay parity through adjustments to employees found to be paid less than would be predicted, especially if those outliers, as we call them, cluster in certain groups, women, people of color, and the like. And that's what's driving pay equity. But what's so interesting is that even after these adjustments are made, and even those organizations that achieve pay parity on an adjusted basis, right, after adjusting for legitimate differences, you will still find that they have large raw pay gaps. So the median pay difference between men and women is still very substantial. The median pay gap for people of color is still quite high. Does that mean they haven't achieved pay parity? No. They have in a technical sense, but there's still the underlying issue that the pay of people reflects where they sit in an organization, what they have achieved from a career standpoint. The career level they're in explains a big part of pay. In what level of the hierarchy do you sit? The role you're in, your access to higher paying jobs, your performance and the like. So even if all else equal, your pay is equivalent to what a similarly situated male would be, say if you're a woman, there's still underlying career factors that are putting your raw pay in a different place. So we want to focus as assiduously on career equity as we've traditionally been focusing on pay equity. And that requires a methodology to really get to the heart of the problem. Just going to show you from a pay standpoint an example of what I'm talking about. This is blinded data from an actual client organization. On the far left, you're seeing the unadjusted pay gaps, the pure raw difference in average pay by gender and by race. Blue is gender, purple is race, and you can see it's quite high, 20% for gender, 22%, the average pay difference for those groups, non-whites versus whites and females versus males. Now we start to build a statistical model that accounts for other relevant factors. So experience generally matters in determining a person's pay. Tenure may matter, time in the labor market, the nature of the roles you've had historically. So in this model, once we account for those differences between people, you can see that the pure gender and race gap decline quite substantially to 15% and 10% respectively. And I keep going on. When I account for roles, the career level, you can see huge drop in the disparity for women from a raw 20% to an adjusted 6%. And I go on and on until we get to a comprehensive model where we're down to a 5% and a 3% difference. I can tell you that most of our clients, they tend to be larger global organizations. Most of them are getting in the 1% to 2% range. If they get below 1%, they kind of declare that they've achieved parity, because there's always error in these models. You know, they then get into a kind of a maintenance mode to try to keep themselves within this legitimate range of parity. But the underlying raw gaps are still there. And that's because these other factors are still not playing out the same way for women as they do men, for people of color as they do whites. The roles people are in, the career levels they're in, the kinds of jobs they get are not on par, and that still shows up in raw pay gaps. So we need to find a way to refocus our attention on the career component. And that is largely what I've tried to do in this white paper, and go back and see what are there lessons we're learning from our assessment of career equity in client organizations that are generalizable enough for employers to take it as a kind of a guide to what they can do. I wanted to spend just a moment on methodology, because it's really important to understand how you can get your hands around the career equity components. For going all the way back to the mid-90s, we embraced this, what we call the internal labor market view of organizations. It's pretty simple. It's just saying, you know, organizations are always in the process of creating their workforces. They bring people in from the outside through recruitment and hiring. They move people through, whether it's through roles, jobs, geographies, across career levels, through training regimens to build their capability and experience. They keep some of those employees and they lose others. Those talent flows and the associated rewards, the rewards that signal what the organization actually values, what really predicts who's going to do well in the company, who's going to stay in the company. Those talent flows and rewards are the internal labor market that create the organization's workforce, and it takes you to places, including the demographic composition of your workforce. So here's an example where we've looked at the organizational hierarchy of salaried workers, career level 4 through 10. The length of the bars in the middle reflect the average annual head counts in those levels, broken down by gender. So you can see if you look at level 6, there are 886 females in that level, 331 males. 8% of that female population comes in every year from the outside. 13% of that population exits on average every year. So that's the turnover rate. And we have similar breakdowns for men on those higher rates and exit rates. And then we also have in the middle the promotion rates, right, which are showing the average annual percent of employees in that category who are promoted from each level every year. And what really, the two things that jump out to in this map. Number one is what I call the flip. This is a bank, had a lot of female employees. But you can see they congregate, they cluster at the bottom. They're the vast majority at the bottom, and suddenly at level 7, you have a flip. And there's a dramatic reduction. In fact, suddenly women are the minority in that career level. Part of that has to do with the existence of a career bottleneck or choke point at level 6. 5% of the women in that level on average are promoted every year, compared to 12% of those 331 men. Right, so you immediately start to see some pattern, raises questions. Could that be why women are leaving at higher rates at that level? This is where the real magic of analytics comes into play, because we move beyond that descriptive picture, which raises questions, to helping to find answers through more advanced predictive modeling. And what our internal labor market analysis involves really is statistically estimating the drivers of each of those talent flows, entry, promotion, retention, and the rewards, pay, performance ratings, and the like, to better understand what is behind those patterns we see, and what are the explained and unexplained differences that may be responsible for the outcomes the organization is experiencing. So typical output from the modeling would be, as you see on this page, so we'll look simultaneously modeling promotion, turnover, whether someone gets a high leadership rating and a high results rating. Many organizations have that GE model in operation. And pay, base pay level, pay growth, total compensation. And we're accounting for the multiple factors that influence all of these outcomes. But on this page, I'm just honing in on the influence of demographics. And you can see a lot of unexplained disparity in this large global consumer products company. You know, if I look African Americans, all else equal, 38% plus less likely to be promoted. Their female colleagues, 36% less likely. They're substantially more likely to turn over. And as you look under the ratings category, dramatically less likely to get high ratings on both the leadership side and the results side. You see differences for females as well, and differences, some for Asians, not too much for Hispanics in this particular organization. So this would be what I call the unexplained differences. Gets the lawyers nervous, gets leadership nervous. Is there bias here? What's the source of the bias? Should we introduce unconscious bias training to try and get line leaders focused on this issue? All important stuff. I don't mean to discount it. But I do mean to suggest that while this is very important, getting to the core of the explained differences can be as potent and maybe even more potent in delivering sustainable progress, because it provides pathways for action, not amorphous concerns about pure bias, which we do want to have, but some very tangible things leaders can follow to address the issue. So on this page, I'm looking at drivers of promotion, right? And again, they're all else equal models, or accounting for many things that are not on this page, but here, honing in on a few that really matter. So you can see an immediate disparity on the fourth line down. Women are 33% less likely to be promoted, all else equal. That's the unexplained difference. This is a large research organization, very well known, actually. And that would be the unexplained difference. If I drop down right below it, row 5, which I've also circled, part-time versus full-time. This is saying all else equal, an employee who is on part-time status compared to an otherwise similarly situated employee who's full-time, you know, same age and tenure and job and location, et cetera. That individual, 32% less likely to be promoted in the following year. And we're usually looking at 3 to 5 year windows of data. Why does that relate to DEI? Because as you'll see in a moment, in most organizations, women are more likely to be on part-time status, right? So you have a kind of a double whammy here. There's a direct, unexplained disparity that hurts women. And now there's a direct impact that if women are less likely to be full-timers, right? And if part-time status hurts you, it's kind of what we call the quantity effect in the market. You have an attribute that is slowing down your career progress, and it's a differential attribute to that of your male counterparts. And so that's what this study is about, kind of look through the many projects that have been involved in recent years to try and see, do some of these jump out as pretty standard, like, for instance, the impact of part-time or flexible work. And in the time I have left, I just want to quickly go through some of those for you. I looked very carefully at 20 organizations. They're kind of a mix of large and mid-size, mostly elite employers, mostly global. Both manufacturing and services are covered, multiple industries. So this is not an industry-dominated set of findings. A lot of employees here, over 700,000, most 40% in the US. And as we have multiple years, 3 to 5 years for each, you have a lot of employee years being analyzed statistically in this study. And what do we find? So first, I'm going to focus on the unexplained differences. And some of these should really jump out. So of the 20 companies, all of them called out gender. And you could do that on a global basis because data are reasonably available. When it comes to race, frankly, it's mostly US, sometimes the UK, Australia, Canada, where you have those data. A lot of other geographies, they don't collect it. They may be prescribed from collecting it. So race will be predominantly driven by the US operations. You go to that top row for women, of the 20 companies, you can see that 55% of them, we find that all else being equal, women are less likely to be promoted. And I have a chart in the study that shows the dimensions. These differences can be very large. 30%, there's no difference. Only 15% of the companies did we find women more likely to be promoted. And that's despite the fact that in 80% of the companies, women, all else equal, are more likely to be highly rated. That's really a virtual universal finding. You'll see not a single one of these companies were women lower rated. They're more likely to be higher rated, 20% on par. And notwithstanding those higher ratings, even after accounting for them, they're less likely to be promoted. A real problem. If you look at race, what really jumps out, well, a couple of things jump out on that row. And let's look at Black, because much of this is driven by the Black experience. It is a virtual universal that Black employees, all else equal, are much less likely to get high performance ratings. So you can see 89, basically all but 2 of the 18 companies where Blacks were separated out as a category, Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, from a broad generic non-white category. In only 2 of the companies did we not see that to be the case. And only one of the company were they more highly rated, and that was a tech firm. And you can see on promotion, not a single instance where Black employees had a little edge from a promotion standpoint, 0%. In most instances, 56% of the companies, they're less likely to be promoted. Now, these are unexplained differences, obviously of great concern, but they kind of flow into explained differences that can be quite substantial. And the ones I'm going to call out are the ones I mentioned earlier. I have a little more detail on it. So let's start with performance ratings. Most organizations like to call themselves performance-oriented organizations. We have a high-performance culture, the CEO will say. And it usually shows up in the data. So here's an example from a large global insurance organization where we're looking at the effect of having a higher rating last year on the probability that you turn over in the following year, that you get promoted in the following year, that you get a high rating in the following year, and you are more engaged. You have a higher engagement score. So you can see ratings matter. Substantial lift to promotion. Top rating, 831% more likely to be promoted, all else equal. Rating 4, almost 400% more likely. These are huge differences. A low rating obviously is there in red. Another thing you'll see is that ratings tend to be persistent over time. So if I have a high rating this year, I have a very much higher probability of getting a high rating next year than if I had an average rating this year. Ratings drive virtually all other outcomes. So the reality that people of color, and particularly Black employees, consistently, universally are getting lower ratings suggests that there is it's an almost impenetrable barrier to broad scale success. If issues around ratings disparities and why these disparities persist, in the models, we're accounting for factors that should influence ratings, individual factors, like your experience and the educational attainment that you have and the job you're in. We're accounting for those, and yet even after accounting for them, we see these very large disparities. What's going on? It suggests that situational factors have an excessive influence on performance assessments, that in many organizations, it's better being lucky than good. And all too often, our Black colleagues are not lucky, quote unquote, in these organizations. That's a problem. The next area I want to emphasize in roles. There are a bunch of roles that can be identified in organizations as what we call accelerator roles, meaning no matter who you are, no matter what your color, no matter what your gender, if you're in that role, all else equal, it lifts the probabilities that you advance and do well in the company. And in contrast, there are dead-end roles. No matter who you are, if you touch them in your career, it kind of flattens the trajectory of opportunity for advancement. And all too often, what we see is that women and people of color are less represented in those accelerator roles. A pretty universal accelerator role is being a supervisor. Seems to matter a lot in most organizations. If you have that flag, supervisor, as opposed to individual contributor in our statistical model, your promotion probability, the probability that you get a high rating, and usually the probability that you stay is greater. It just is a lift to your career. And you can see the dimensions in this particular financial services company, how big it is, 50% on promotion, 55% on high rating. And when you go outside the US to the global workforce, 89% on enhancement to promotion probability, 37% on rating, and 16% more likely to stay, all else being equal. Interestingly, in this company, being a supervisor had an even bigger impact on women. Now, that's kind of the good news. Look how big those are, 74% on the third row there for women, higher promotion probability when they're supervisors, all else equal. And you can see the rest. So that would be a good sign. But then you get the bad news in the raw data at the bottom of this page, which is simply in the company, the percent of each group who are in supervisor roles. So in this company, 24% of men have a supervisor flag, only 13% of women. So while women do great once they're in supervisor roles, bottom line is they're not getting there with anywhere near the same frequency as their male colleagues. And by the way, when they get there, it tends to be later in their career compared to men. So they miss the full lift that having these accelerator roles early in career give to their male colleagues. And look at white, non-white, 19% whites are supervisors, only 10% non-white. Again, blacks in the most challenged position, only 8% in supervisory roles. So it's, again, very clear-cut signal that says, look, we know that success in this company is enhanced by being in certain roles, like a supervisor role. We also know that we're not getting are women and people of color in those roles to an extent sufficient to allow them to have the same opportunity to succeed as their male and white counterparts. And on this page, I'm going to pick up the pace a little because I want to make sure we have time for questions and discussions. You know, on this page, you're seeing results from models of turnover, retention, rating probability, promotion. I'm just narrowing in on these situational factors like role, who your supervisor is, and what are the characteristics of your team. You can see supervisor roles are real big lift to promotion probability. Client-facing positions much more likely to get you promoted. But also look at the green around the people you report to. So if you report to a high-performing supervisor as opposed to an average performer, you yourself are more likely to get highly rated and much more likely to be promoted, particularly if it's top-rated and high-rated as a broad category. And reporting up matters a lot. So say the average reporting relationship is 2 career levels. Typical employee reports to someone 2 levels above her or him. And you as an employee report to someone 3 levels above. What the modeling is telling us is you're going to do significantly better on ratings and promotion. Maybe that person has more clout. Maybe that person is managing a business that is getting more resources and is more of a growth driver. You're advantaged situationally. And similarly, from a team perspective, I'll just call out one here. Being part of a small team really hurts you. You see the red, minus 82%. So if this is four employees, we kind of had the median team size, and you're saying you're less than that here, no matter who you are, you're much less likely to be promoted. Well, guess what? We then put the demographic lens on these situational drivers, and virtually all of them work against women and people of color. They're less likely to be in the accelerator role. They're less likely to be reporting to the right supervisor. And particularly Blacks, much more likely to be on small teams. Career killer in this particular company. I'm not going to go over this slide. It's just showing how valuable mobility and broad experience are in this large global pharma. And the reality is that you had to move around a lot to succeed here. That was their leadership model. Women and often people of color were just not as mobile. They're either not being given the opportunity or family situations are preventing them from moving. So you have a whole leadership model built on the presumption that mobility is key to building breadth, and it's acting in a way to deny women, people of color, the opportunity to get into that leadership pipeline. Something had to be done. And then finally, on flexible work arrangements. So this is a bank. I'm just focusing in on disability and family leave. Look at family maternity. All else equal, employee out on family and maternity leave, almost 200% more likely to leave the company in the following year. A big detriment to promotion probability, negative across the board, and negative associations with pay. This hit women particularly hard. And in this company, some common patterns, but a little glimmer of hope. I wanted to share this one because this is a client we worked with on an ongoing basis. You can see part-time, it's red across the board. So employees who are part-time and employees who are remote, not doing particularly well. And employees currently out on leave, facing negative prospects. But you see some green below. That used to be bright red, and the differentials were significant. But this organization recognized that the way they were managing leave policies were really hurting women. They were absolute career killers for women in an organization that desperately needed to strengthen its pipeline of female future leaders. And so it's an issue they had to contend with. And, you know, two ways to deal with it is you deliberately ensure that people who are out on leave or have been recently on leave, that you're taking that into account and not allowing it to have negative impacts on pay and promotion. You're thwarting the stereotype, if you will. And the other way we see a lot in European companies is you try to break through the pattern where it's women. This is women going out on leave. And you encourage men to take paternity leave, to also take family leave and caregiving leave. And that's what this organization did. And you can see it really was starting to have an impact, really starting to have an effect. So I want to roll this up into the practical implications for business leaders. All right, so you have all this result of analytical work. Now what? What do you do with all these data? Well, one thing you can do with it is practice something we call proactive career management. So literally build an empirically based success profile. Identify the factors. This is a consumer retail company. You can see 12 factors most associated with better likelihood of being promoted. And here I'm comparing men versus women, and I'm dividing it into what we call Q and P. I'm an economist. Internal labor markets, all markets have quantities and prices. So the quantity is the characteristic itself, the attribute. Do you have it? The price is the value that attribute gives to you from a promotion standpoint. So let me give you a simple example. Really important to be an expat in this company. They did the best in terms of getting into top leadership roles. You see a downward arrow on the Q for women, which means women were far less likely to be in expat positions, all right? You see no difference on the price, which meant those women who did have the good luck or fortune or drove themselves into expat roles did as well and benefited as much from that status as did their male counterparts. Go down to 10, being a supervisor. Here again, really important, but women less likely to be supervisors. You see the downward arrow, and then you also see the downward diamond, triangle on row 10, which meant not only were they less likely to get into that role, but once they were there, it's not benefiting them in the same way. The value isn't coming through. Very different from that other case example I gave you. So the price effect is hurting them. But most of the effects in this organization are around quantities, just getting people positioned to succeed, being in the right roles, reporting to the right people, having the right job status, being on the right teams. Those factors strongly predictive of what happens to people and typically working against underrepresented minorities, working against women. And so what are our clients doing with these kind of data? Well, two approaches. One is they develop a checklist. And they say, we're going to give our supervisors these checklists. These are things to be attentive to. The green lights are the success drivers. As you look at the talent in your team, are there individuals up and coming, talent that you think are at risk of stalling out or of leaving the company? Let's try to improve these situational factors so it's not working against them. And similarly, the red flags, being in certain parts of the business, experience a supervisor change. Those are situational attributes that really were working against the individual. Try to make sure those are not affecting your up and coming talent who you want to keep and you want to have succeed. That's how it's done at kind of a disaggregated basis, distributed basis. Clients tend to be worried about this, could be too sensitive, getting too much data out to too many people. So more often than not, they'll do these kind of assessments at the aggregate level, whether it's central HR or it's DEI. They'll kind of look at their workforce, scan their female talent, scan their minority talent against the green lights and against the red flags and say, who in our workforce that we really want to keep and help thrive are in good positions, so they're being well positioned to succeed, and who is at a disadvantage. And then use this thing we call proactive career management to try and address the situational barriers, at least, that are preventing the success of your DEI strategy and ultimately the success of your business. So the takeaways I'd like to leave with you very quickly are the following. Look, yes, talent and drive matter. A lot of organizations are legitimately performance-driven, and they care a lot about it. And what you as an individual do matters a lot. But I think leaders are always surprised by the extent to which our statistical models show that situational factors are driving a large part of the outcomes. And that all too often women and people of color are just not well positioned situationally to succeed in the same way as their white and male counterparts. And so with that knowledge in mind, knowing that so many companies, so many employers face this, the idea of using analytics to build an empirical success profile, an empirical retention profile, and then see how different groups fare against that profile. See, do they have the same profile? Or do we have one success profile for white males and another success profile for Black women? That, that's very problematic. It's helpful to know that, and then use that information to deploy something like proactive career management to address those issues head on. My final word to you on this is the reason we're seeing this be more successful is it's rooting DEI in the business, right? Because in most organizations, the things that influence success have some legitimacy, even if they're situational. There may be a part of the business that's more important to the whole organization than another. There may be certain supervisors who are better leaders than others. So yes, things that drive success tend to be associated with higher business value. With this kind of empirical approach, you can ensure that your DEI strategy is playing out on that business landscape, that it's linked to things that matter to the business, and what you're doing is getting the barriers out of the way, getting the impediments to success removed, so you're giving true opportunity for all of your employees, regardless of their demographics, to succeed and thrive in the organization. So with that, I will pass it back to Anna.
Thank you so much. If you can bring us back from your presentation to the room so that we can see your face. We have a couple of questions. We're not going to take questions live because we only have 10 minutes. A couple of, first of all, this is groundbreaking. This is groundbreaking. I think we've been always asking questions about what is the ROI on D&I, right? And we are not, I think when I saw your report, by the way, the recording is going to be available to everyone, as well as the link to the report, the full report with the data and the presentation. So all of these materials are going to be made available to everyone who registered. And thank you so much for coming in and listening live. But the question is, there's a role for organization, there's a role for individual, there's a role for the ecosystem, right? Yeah. So what kind of responsibility, if we can break it down, or opportunity can an individual take with these data? An organization needs to take, and then the ecosystem, by which I mean regulatory, government, universities and other types of organizations, to help even the playing field for all people in the workplace.
That's such a great question, and it gets a little bit to the origin of the white paper. A couple of years ago, I gave a talk to the Wasserman Center and the counseling team. It was all about, career counseling and what should new talent about to enter the labor market be aware of. So I talked about some preliminary findings from this research through the employee lens, not the employer lens. And it was all about what should you pay attention to. So if you're, say, a woman of color entering the workforce, thinking about a job with a particular employer, having that checklist yourself, knowing that there's certain things that really get in the way and certain things that really enhance, and having the daring to ask the questions, to ask the employer when they say, oh, we have good career opportunities here, to demonstrate that, to show you examples, if not hard data, on what happens to people like you in that organization. It's not out of bounds anymore. It would have been out of bounds, I'd say, even 5 years ago. It's not out of bounds anymore. There's a sea change. I've been doing ILM analyses going back to 1994. And we would always account for demographics in the models, but we'd have to be very careful about the demographic results. And usually they'd be delivered as a side report commissioned by legal. It's not true anymore. Companies realize this is important to their business. They realize they're under scrutiny. More and more investors are evaluating through ESG, right? Whether the companies are just companies, are companies that pursue equity. So you as an employee, be proactive and take some of these examples, take the checklist and say, how do you fare from this standpoint? And they may not know the answer to some of the questions, which would be legitimate. I wouldn't hold that against them, but it shows you're actively engaged and you're trying to learn the reality of the organization. I flipped the lens for this white paper to employers because, frankly, we give advice to employers and we call it a guide. I think employers can do so much. There's a social justice movement out there trying to close gaps, the wealth gap, the health gap, and the like. Our reality is we work with some of the largest progressive, I'll put that in quotes, organizations and employers in the world. They mean well. They're increasingly dedicated to this, and yet you see the kind of outcomes that are observed there. So if these employers can get their own house in order, the contribution to the larger society will be huge. The ability to really influence where we get from an equity and justice standpoint can be very dramatic. So the leaders who want to advance, lead the way, bring more discipline to this area. Don't just rely on check the box, oh, good employers have this practice or that practice. No. Understand your workforce. That's how you connect it to the business. And then you can communicate it to others by saying, this is about our business. It's not just about meeting some arbitrary goals. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, that's an excellent question. Answer. Well, just one really quick comment. As you know, there's a huge emphasis on skills these days. Skills is the solution to all, right? We've got a lot of skills training, and if you train people on skills and get them into jobs, education is not, higher ed is not required. And it seems like for many that skills, commitment to skills is the way to solve for a lot of these issues. But I think what your research is proving is that it takes a lot more than just the skills alone, right? Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important observation. We're very much in a skills-oriented environment. There's a lot of talk about moving away from traditional models of employment to kind of disaggregated, decomposed jobs. So you decompose the job into tasks, and then you go to the market to get those tasks fulfilled. And there are some potential advantages to that from an equity standpoint, but it's not going to predominate. Organizations exist for a reason. And what we found when we do the deep dive on skills is that typically the differentiators in organizations are not the hard skills, the science capability, right? The the background in particular fields. Most organizations are able to get that, though there are certain pockets where there are shortages in talent supply, and you gotta to deal with that. But it is what we would traditionally have called the softer skills, the management skills, problem solving, team building skills that are often cited as the most challenging area. And I'm afraid those are areas that lend themselves more to stereotyping. So in that one example where I show the pharma with all of the unexplained disparities, you may have seen that leadership ratings, that for most racial groups, there was no statistical difference in the probability of getting a high results rating. But there were, for every single minority group, there was a very sizable difference in leadership rating. What did that tell us? It tells us they have a monolithic model of leadership. The idea of what it takes to be a good leader fits into one mold. And the company is using the elements of that mold to determine and rate talent on the basis of leadership skill. And it's working against people of color. They're being basically told they're not good leaders. Well, that's not the reality. The reality is they may not fit the mold of what a traditional white male leadership posture is. And that company really opened their leadership eyes. They threw away their leadership model. They dropped the GE 9-box performance and leadership evaluation to create a whole new one that recognized people lead in different ways. And we can't have a monolithic model of leadership to drive it. So I'm wary of skills, particularly when it comes to what we call the soft skills, because they're very vulnerable to stereotyping and that kind of application of monolithic ideas.
And that's so brilliant and so timely because of all the conversations that we are having today. Thank you so much. We are against the time here, 5 o'clock. A lot of the students here will have their classes starting very soon. Thank you very much. It was such a high point for us to finish this Rethinking work series for this semester. Stay tuned for the events coming up starting in February, and do follow us on LinkedIn. And Hake, thank you so much. We are looking forward to staying in touch with you with your research. We'll be teaching it in our classes, and we'll take full advantage of educating the next generation of leaders on all of these issues. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.